Welcome to GRE Snacks, snackable episodes about the GRE, GMAT, and graduate school admission. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable GRE course that includes everything you need to ace your GRE exam. A full textbook, videos on key topics, tons of GRE questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, a built-in study planner, and machine learning essay grader, and full-length practice exam. You can try it out for free by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to get 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. Today, we have Brian Prestia from Reason Test Prep. Brian, I'd love if you could introduce yourself and say a little bit about your company.
Sure. Thanks for having me back, Tyler. My name is Brian Prestia from Reason Test Prep. I'm the owner. We do GMAT, GRE, SAT, and ACT tutoring online. And yeah, we've been doing, or I've been in this business for a couple decades now, about 20 years.
Yeah, that's a fair amount of time.
Longer than I
Very
thought I'd be
cool.
in it when I started for sure.
Yeah. Well, great. So today we're going to be talking about time management strategies for both GRE and GMAT Quant, but these are ones that are specific to the problem types, right? And I feel like that's really interesting just to kind of dig into. There are specific question types where you can really save a lot of time if you employ certain strategies. And then obviously just with all the questions, there are certain time saving strategies that are really helpful. So excited to dig into this one.
Yeah, I mean, as I think I said on the previous podcast, you could think about kind of global time management strategies and how you manage yourself through a section, and then there's like the more specific stuff you can do on individual questions to be faster. And maybe we can, the GMAT quant section is all problem solving questions, and then the GRE is mostly problem solving questions, and then you've got the QCs. So maybe we can talk about the problem solving question specifically because that's really what's common to both, and that's the bulk of the GRE quant. It's where people I think
Mm-hmm.
struggle the most on time anyway, and then it's entirely what you have on the GMAT quant.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. So let's start there.
Okay, so let's knock out the kind of obvious stuff first, and then get into the more complicated stuff after. So I
Yeah.
guess the first thing that, yeah, again, this is a little bit stating the obvious, but I think this is important, is that there are question types that, one can and should get better at, right? If you're someone who is struggling with time and you are running out of time every time you do the GRE quant section or GMAT quant section, well, aside from just the global time management stuff, there's things you can do on an individual question basis. And the first thing is, could you be better, more efficient in how you answer certain question types? So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, something that comes to mind here is like weighted average. Weighted average is a great example where like a lot of people, they don't recognize that they're even looking at a weighted average question when they see it. So let's say it's like a mixture question, right? And they don't really understand that that really is a weighted average question. Or it's just, plain vanilla weighted average and they don't see it as such. And so, that's a question that a person might spend 3 minutes on to like really solve, let's say, like algebraically. But there are ways to do weighted average questions in like 30 seconds if you really understand how to do those questions and you can identify them. So that's, I guess, the first thing I would say is, if you're struggling with time, learning to recognize certain question types and just be more effective in how you approach those question types, that's going to go a long way to, solving your timing issues.
Yeah, and I think that just like diagnosis is kind of the first key skill you need to learn regardless, right? Because without if you don't diagnose correctly, you can't apply tactics correctly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you need to be, some listeners may, have a tutor, that's helpful, but like even if you have one, you need to be your own coach, right? You need to be able to look at practice tests, look at practice questions and be like, okay, I got that question right, but I spent 3.5 minutes, right? And like that's just too much. So what do I need to do to be faster and better on this particular question type? And then, if you identify, okay, it's a weighted average question, you know what? I didn't even know it was a weighted average question. Well, okay, you
Right.
need to be better at identifying that. And you need to have tactics for how you're going to, deal with that particular type of question. So, yeah, I think that's like step one is identify questions that you're weak at, or maybe you're getting them right, but you're just spending too much time and, practice them and learn how to be more efficient.
Yeah, and that's a key piece also. If you do not get this from your prep program or from your tutor, you should really be timing every practice question that you take and being accurate about it. Because at the end of the day, you've got to be able to solve questions in the time, or it's just as bad as getting it wrong.
Yeah, I mean it could be worse, right? I mean if you spend 6 minutes and get a question right, you almost would have been better off throwing it away and getting it wrong than spending 6 minutes to get it right, right? It's like a Pyrrhic victory where it's the
Yes,
cost outweighs the outweighs the win.
one of my favorite vocab words, Pyrrhic victory.
Yeah, I love that. I use it almost always in this context of someone spending 5 minutes to get something right, and it's like they won the battle, but they're going to lose the war.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's the first one. What's sort of the next one up on your list here?
Okay, so I guess the next thing is let me just kind of frame this in a particular way that might be helpful. This is just the way I think of it. But I think of kind of three pathways on let's just say a GRE or GMAT problem solving question. One pathway is what I would call like all in, right? You're just fully solving it, fully answering it. Not that you're not worried about time, but you're like, I'm just gonna really, crank through this question entirely and get it right, right? That's one option. Polar opposite of that is to just throw it away, right? So, like we talked about on the previous podcast, on the GRE, you could just flat out just skip a question, not even answer it. On the GMAT, you could just, throw in an answer quickly. We could talk more about how to make a better educated guess quickly, but I would call that just like dumping the question, right? So, Tyler, again, just in my experience, because I have a feeling you're not the norm and that you've got good time management skills, but
I don't know if they're as good as you think they are, but I appreciate the compliment anyway.
so, uh, believe it or not, most people don't even have that second option. All they have is all in. They're all in on every question, right? So just
Mhm.
basically getting them to like recognize that they can throw a question away, that itself is like a victory. Then you've got a third option, which I call kind of like a halfway, sort of like a halfway approach, right? Where you're
Mhm.
kind of dipping your foot in the water, but you're not diving completely in and you're not, walking around the pool entirely. And
Yes, I think that was a favorite of mine,
mm,
where I would like start a question, try and see if I could figure it out, and then I would try to move on quickly if I couldn't. But I feel like that the worst of both worlds.
no, 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 no. Well, it depends on how you do it. So I was about to praise you. So, because I think most people don't do that, but it does depend on how you do it. So I'm either going to praise you or I'm gonna pan you. Um, so I think if you're like, oh, like let me you're like I'm just all in, right? And then 3 minutes go by and you're like, okay, I didn't get it. Like, I guess I better move on. No, that is the worst thing you could do, basically, right? If you're going to
Yeah.
spend a lot of time on a question, you better get it right. Otherwise, that is just about the worst thing you could do. But I think there's a different mentality where you're not necessarily aiming to fully solve it, right? You're just like, let
Mhm.
me kind of get it going, and maybe that's what I thought you were describing. But let me kind of get it going
Yeah.
and see where this goes, and if maybe it will lead somewhere. Maybe I can narrow it down to two answers, make an educated guess. Like you're not really fully aiming to solve it, but you're not throwing it away completely.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I'm probably in that boat,
Okay,
but I might probably still be spending too long on it.
okay. Well then, I'm gonna mostly praise you.
Okay, that's good. I appreciate that. Um, but yeah, no, you said something there that I really liked, which is if you spend a bunch of time on a problem and you get it wrong, that's the worst thing you can do. And I think that that actually is such a good frame of reference for this, which is like you should, especially on the GRE where you can skip more easily, you should really be able to look at a problem and be like, I can solve this. And if you can, then you should do it. And if you can't, then, think about skipping it, saving it for later kind of thing. And that might mean that you skip half the questions, right? But like also that, well, hopefully you'll have a lot of time after that because you only solved the ones that you knew 100% you could get right.
Right. Now, I would say though that both on the like I'm throwing it away and I'm going to spend, a total of 20, 30 seconds on this question and the like kind of what I call halfway approach, right? Where you're making an effort to get something better than a almost complete guess, but you're not necessarily aiming to fully solve it. So I think there's like specific things you could do to be better at both of those things. And if you want, I can explain some of the specific tactics.
Yeah, sure. Let's do that.
Okay, maybe talking about the halfway approach thing first, right? So some of these tactics spill over into other strategies that I would teach and that we teach. So using the answer choices, right? That's usually in the industry that's often referred to as back solving, right? But like it doesn't have to be fully back solving. Like I'm gonna fully answer this question. It could be, let me look at the answers and see if I can start to eliminate some answers. Some of these just seem unlikely to be right. You know what? I actually, now that I'm looking at it, I think 3 of these are very, very unlikely to be right. I think it's one of these 2, right? Well, okay, now you could either, you're still kind of almost dumping it at that point where like, well, I'll just pick one of these and move on. Maybe you've spent, 40 seconds total, 30 seconds. Or at that point, maybe you just try one of those 2 answers. You know what I mean? And, and if it's not one of them, maybe you guess the other. But like, it's the mentality of, I'm not necessarily going to sit here and do the whole question. I'm just going to see how far this takes me on, with these couple answers.
Right. And doing that quickly, right? Not sitting there and pondering it.
Yes. Yeah. So that's funny and tragic also, because a lot of people do that. I don't want to pull us into data sufficiency, but on the GMAT, this happens a lot on data sufficiency, but it happens overall in both tests where people spend like 2 minutes kind of conceptual. They're in this like conceptual headspace. And then finally they're like, okay, now I'm going to do this. And it's like, okay, I love that you had the idea to do that, but you really have to, if that's what you're going to do, you've got to dive into that in the first 30 seconds. Like 2 minutes in now, and it's a little too late. Really, you got to, as you said, you can't dilly-dally. You need to make a pretty quick decision about what you're going to do and go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. There's more I could say, beyond that. I mean, another thing that we teach people, well, there's a few things. I guess another thing that we teach people that's related to kind of just looking at the answer choices is, so this is true of both the GRE and the GMAT, is that, I think you're going to like this too, because I feel this aligns with things that we've talked about before. But that like the test is a reasoning test. Both tests are reasoning tests, right? They're testing your problem solving ability, your reasoning ability, quantitative reasoning, obviously on the quant section. But they're definitely not really the test makers or the writers. They're not interested in your ability to do tedious, annoying math. That's just not really the game, right? So because of that, when the math gets really tedious and ugly, it's just unlikely to be right. And you can leverage that even in looking at the answer choices, right? Because you can look at, there are questions I use when I tutor that are just great examples of this, where, you could look at the answer choices and be like, okay, these answers right here are going to lead to disgusting math. Now, it's not impossible that those are right, but there's 2 answers here that are going to lead to really nice, clean math. And those are like way, 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 way more likely to be right. So whether you're just going to take those and gas and move on, or actually just start with those, like that's another way to just be more efficient.
Well, I would add to that, because really, I remember on the GMAT, a question that like stuck with me, which was, it was basically like, what is 1,000,001 squared minus 999,999 squared?
Yeah.
And this question, like at the time, I was just like, like you said, if you were to do the math, it's really, really ugly.
Right.
And the provided calculator won't solve it for you. Right. Because it's the number is like larger than 8 digits or whatever.
Right.
So really, like, it's actually a difference of squares problem, but I didn't realize that. So there was no quick way for me to solve it. Right. But it, like, if you're staring at a problem like that and you're saying, what the hell is 1,000,001 squared? That's probably not the way to solve it. No. Like, or if it's like, wow, I need the decimal value of like 57√3. That's probably not the way to solve it, right? Like, there's something else going on.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can be really annoying when you like end up in a dead end and that's where you're at. But at the end of the day, like you said, it's so much better to just cut bait and move on. than to try and force something that you're not really even sure how to solve anyway.
Yeah, I think so. In that situation, I think what I'd want to say and what I'd want people to do is, look, if you realize that there must be some fast way to do that, you can't possibly be expected to like do all this like crazy tedious math. Well, either you
Mhm.
see the path or you don't. And if you don't see the path, you shouldn't do the question, at least not in that moment, right? Because there are
Mhm.
people who will see the path, right? You know what I mean? Like there
Mhm.
are people who look at that question and can get it right in 40 seconds. If you
Yeah.
realize that you're missing something and you're not in that cohort, well, move on because you're
Yeah.
playing, you're fighting the wrong battle, basically. I mean, I go back to like,
Yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah, go back to the battle analogy, right? But it's kind of like, you know, you're you're trying to cross a river and the other guy has horses and you don't. Well, a 4 foot high river is suddenly a much bigger problem for
right,
you.
exactly.
You should probably not do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I would take this whole thing one step further though. So let me explain how this could even benefit you in terms of like, what I'm calling this halfway approach, right? So I'm going to reference another question I've seen. This one happens to be a GMAT question, but it could be a GRE question as well. It's basically like you have a boat that's going upstream and then downstream. And it's a very hard rate question, basically, right? And it
Mhm.
tells you that it takes the boat half an hour longer to go upstream than it does to go downstream, and it's got variables in it. Pretty tough question. And then the question is, how many hours did it take the boat to go downstream, right? And the answers are 2.1 hours, 2.2 hours, 2.3 hours, 2.4 hours, and 2.5 hours. I would look at that question and say, okay, well, first of all, 2.5 hours is a nice clean number, right? And 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4 are not. If you couple that with the fact that the upstream is a half an hour longer, well, then it's like a doubly pretty answer versus doubly ugly answers, right? Because the 2.5 hours, downstream is going to be 3 hours upstream. That's beautiful.
Mhm.
That's like clean math. That's clean numbers. The other one is going to be 2.1 hours downstream and 2.6 hours upstream. Those are both ugly and they're both going to lead to really annoying math. And so, like, just on that alone, I would say the answer is, I don't want to go overboard here, but on that question, the first time I saw it, I was about 80% sure the answer was 2.5 without even doing anything. Right. So
Mhm.
that's a case of, either you kind of take it again, you could either quote dump it really and just like pick 2.5, or you could just try 2.5 and see if you can
Mhm.
confirm it. Honestly, if you're that confident it's 2.5, though, you're probably wasting your time to even try it, because then if it's not 2.5, well, then you're kind of stuck and you have four equally likely answers. You're really best off there just picking 2.5 and moving on.
Right. And basically, maybe flagging it or like getting ready to come back later if you have extra time to really solve it. But
Right.
yeah, that's like a good shortcut. I mean, I think in general also the approach of like think like the test makers serves you very well in most of these situations, right? If you can put yourself in the headspace of the people that make the tests and be like, if I was trying to do this, this is what I would do. Like that can often help a lot.
Totally. Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, I have another tactic that you made me think of. I wasn't even thinking of this one, but once you said the example of the million and one squared minus 999,999 squared. This tactic might not work that well in that situation. It's really better in more in like kind of number property type questions. But another tactic you can use when you're stuck and you don't want to sit there and do tedious math is make like a simple, what I would call a simple parallel example, right? So in a case like that, what if you did like, 101 squared minus 99 squared? Right? And
Mhm.
see, that you could do on the calculator on the GRE, see what that equals, and see if the pattern of the answer matches one of the answer choices, right? Like, let's say the answer is, all the answers are 2 to some power, right? We'll
Mhm.
see how, like, what the power is when you do 101 squared minus 99 squared, and how that would, if you scale that back up to a million and one squared minus 999,999 squared, maybe you can guess at what the right power would be based on like your simple parallel example.
Right. Yeah, and it does get you around like the way that they build some questions intentionally to be not solvable by the calculator when the calculator would easily solve them.
Right.
You can just like, because that was something I like. I didn't think about it in the moment. In the moment, I kind of like and just like skip. But afterwards, I was like, I should have just done 1,001 squared and 999 squared. See what the answer came out to, and then the larger version of it. Or you could do 1,000.0001 and then 99.999, right? Like you can kind of get around things a little bit.
Yeah.
To at least give you the direction and maybe the shape of the answer, right? Like for instance, if you're doing, like a long division type problem and a bunch of the answers have root 3 in it, and then like a couple of the answers don't,
right.
Well, those ones that don't have the root 3, they're not going to have a decimal after it if you try and just like calculator solve it.
Right.
So like little things like that can give clues at least.
Yeah. I mean, one more thing maybe related to the answer choices is like how far they're spaced. That's not relevant on every question. It kind of depends on the question. But, again, I'm thinking of an actual question here where it's like, how many numbers between, 1 and 99 are basically not divisible by 2 or 3. Neither divisible by 2 nor 3, right? And like that is not an easy question for most people, but it really like the spacing of the answers matters, right? So if the answers are 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, well, now you need to be exactly right. If you're off by 1, you're not getting the question right. Whereas if the answers are, 30, 33, 40, 47, and 52, well, now there's much more cushion there. And there's two things. One is you could probably be faster because you could just kind of estimate and not worry about getting it, dotting every I and crossing every T. And secondly, there's less of a chance you're going to spend the time and have nothing to show for it, right? So I think in both of those cases, like how you think about timing and how you think about how to approach the question or whether to even do it, should be partly driven by the answer choices themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes, for instance, if it's like a question that involves a comparison, sometimes the answer choices will be like half of them are above, half of them are below, right? So it's like, okay, well, if I can figure out whether we're above or below, already doing a lot better, right? So it's like, I think there's just, but also then if it's half above, half below, like then you're like, okay, a key piece of this question is which way does it go and why? Right. So you got to just make sure you're extra careful with that step, but it does kind of get you at least to a 50-50. So it's like little things like that, right? It's like, why are the answer choices this way? What does it mean about the question? Kind of like thinking like the test maker. Again, I think that's all really good advice.
Yeah, I think just in general, people, again, just from practice, I can tell you in tutoring, people they need to zoom out. You know what I mean? They don't even look at the answer choices. They'll just read the question and like immediately start solving it. And you really need to kind of zoom out, take the whole question, including the answer choices. That's part of the question, right? And, take a second and think about how you want to approach it or whether you even want to approach it. Or just make a guess and move on. I think most people, that's just not even part of the like decision tree in their mind. They just look at the question and don't even look at the answers and just immediately start solving it and never really question whether they should solve it at all or at the very least like approach it in that way.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Well, so anything else that's kind of general problem solving for both tests? Because if not, I want to get into the test specific one. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe one more like tactic because we kind of forked over into this sort of halfway approach conversation, but we never really talked about the dumping questions and how you can maybe increase your odds there a little bit. So I don't think this is the biggest deal, but another thing is that answer choices that like basically the answer choice that combines the most commonly appearing elements in the rest of the answer choices is a bit more likely to be right than any of the other answers. So like if you have like root 2 in 3 of the answers and then root 3 in one and root 5 in another, I'd say it's probably more likely. I mean, it is more likely to be one of the ones with root 2. And if there are other commonalities, like 3 of them are fractions and 2 of them are not, or like things like that. You can kind of leverage all of that, and there's a whole logic for why I'd say it's more likely, but I mean, it just is a little bit more likely. And so if you're, again, this could be filtered through your algorithm of like even the decision of whether to dump a question, right? There are questions you're going to dump and it's a 1 in 5 guess. And I mean, the answers are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you have absolutely no idea what it is. And, it's a 20% chance of guessing it, right? But if there's a question that looks really hard and you think you can increase your odds, by looking at the answers and making a guess, well, that's like the perfect storm of like, all right, well, the perfect, like, I'm pretty sure I don't know how to do this, or it would take me forever. And I think I'm more likely to get it than just a 20% guess. Well, then, yeah, that's a good one to just guess on and move on.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think in general, again, it's like triage. Triage is the name of the game on both of these.
Yeah.
So I know we covered this on our last podcast a little bit, but I'd love to go into the GRE specific and GMAT specific uh, time saving tips for the quant, right? And really for the GRE specific ones, guessing is a much bigger part of it. Like guessing, moving on quickly, and then coming back to review questions that you flagged, because you can go back for the entire section and change answers. But then also there's the GRE quantitative comparison question type, which has some specific tips. So
Yeah.
if you don't mind just kind of running through those quickly here, just so we kind of have a complete episode for this one. Too.
Yeah, of course. I mean, just to set it aside, the GMAT quant is only the problem solving question. So there's really, unless we're talking about data insights, we can kind of set that aside. But for
Sure.
GRE, I guess a few things. First of all, you do have the fill in the blank questions, right, on the GRE. You also have, not many, but you do have some fill in the blank questions. And then you also have the like select all that apply questions, right? So I guess the first thing, there's not a lot to say here other than you're statistically less likely to get those questions right. You know what I mean? So if you see a fill in the blank question that you really are not sure you know how to do, well, you definitely shouldn't do it, right? That's really, really a bad decision to spend time on those.
Yeah.
So I guess that's one thing is I would definitely be more aggressive about skipping those 2 question types than anything else. And then for the quantitative comparisons, yeah, as I was saying in our previous podcast, I just think people don't appreciate how much of an opportunity those questions are to make back time, basically. And it's unfortunate because those questions usually come first, right? So people spend more time on them than they should, and then don't have enough time for the the problem solving questions and all the ones to follow. So I mean, first of all, I don't do this. I don't really recommend it, but you could start with the problem solving questions and just skip all the QCs and go back. I mean, that might be one thing. But I think a better thing is to really view them as, again, it's like it's kind of echoes what we've been saying in this whole conversation, but there's got to be some calculation going on in your head a little bit about how likely am I to get this question right, and how much longer is it going to take to increase that certainty. Do you know what I mean? This is especially true on the QCs. So, so if let's just say you number pick, right? And right away you see that quantity B is bigger with the values that you picked. At that point, you're at a 50-50, right? You have a 50% chance of getting the question right. It's either B or D. D is, not enough information, right? So then the question should be, in some cases it's like not that hard. Why wouldn't I just pick another number and see if I can get, quantity A to be bigger or, something like that? Sure, that's fine.
Which then would be D, right?
Right, exactly. So that makes sense. But in other cases, maybe it's going to take a long time to pick another number. Or more importantly, maybe you already have a strong hunch that A is a trap and that most people are going to think like, oh, of course, like, x cubed is bigger than x squared or something like that. And so you sense that that's a trap, but you figure that probably there are going to be some scenarios in which quantity A would be bigger, right? Like if they're both 0, they'd be equal, if you're dealing with negative numbers or something like that. So, anyway, yeah, I think there are opportunities to just be like, you know what? I already have a 50-50, but it's not really 50-50. I'm about, 80% sure that it's actually going to be D here. Why not just take it? flag the question, and come back, right? And save
Yep.
that time for something else where you actually like a problem solving question that you know how to solve, but there's just no way to do it in under 2 minutes. And you need that 2 minutes in order to get that question right. And if you don't spend the 2 minutes, you're going to get nothing, right? Like it's just 2 minutes to solve it. And you're not going to really be able to make a guess until you spend all those 2 minutes. Well, then you should be faster on the quantitative comparison where you already have an 80% guess in 30 seconds.
Right. Yeah, and also that just reminds me of another tip that I remember from some other time, which is when in doubt on quantitative comparison, the answer is D. Move on. Right? Like if you can't figure it out, maybe it's because you can't figure it out. Maybe
Yeah.
that's the answer, right?
Yeah. I would
Yeah.
maybe amend that a little bit and say almost more my advice would be whatever seems obvious is what you shouldn't pick, right? So for example, when I wouldn't pick D is when you look at the question and it's like, okay, well, obviously there's no way you can answer this. Well, that's exactly when it's not going to be D, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah, yeah.
right? So like then you definitely shouldn't pick D. And then there are other cases where it's like, okay, like obviously A is bigger. Well, then it's probably D because most people are going to think it's A, but what's the point of the question if it's just obvious and you don't even have to think about it, right?
Yeah, there's no gimmies on these tests.
No, no. Unless you, like you said, think like the test maker and kind of, I don't know,
Suss
zig.
out why it's a
Yeah.
gimme. Yeah.
Or I was going to say like zig when everyone else is going to zag. You know what I mean? Like then maybe it feels like a gimme, but yeah, no, I mean, everything is meant to be difficult and tricky. Even the easier QCs, they're not so easy that you don't have to think. They're just easier than, the hard ones.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Any other kind of parting thoughts here?
No, I mean, I think like we said before, I think it's about, thinking like the test maker and taking a step back and really thinking about how you're going to approach questions intelligently and not making it a math game where you just think you're studying for a math test. That's obviously not the way the GRE or the GMAT are. And I think you need to practice like that. That's the other thing I guess we haven't really talked about, but like just you've got to practice with the mentality of I need to train myself to think cleverly, to use logic, to use reasoning, and it's not just going to happen, by listening to this. You've got to actually like practice it and make it manifest.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. This has been GRE Snacks, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Brian Prestia from Reason Test Prep. And Achievable has a great online GRE course. Try it out for free by going to achievable.me. And if you like it, use the code podcast and you can get 10% off.